The prophecy of Isaiah. We've now reached presentation 8, which is entitled God's Message. Just reflecting back for a moment or two. King Ahaz, not been a great king. He'd collaborated and sought help from Assyria, the arch enemy. And he'd led his people astray spiritually. But Isaiah was picturing a king that would be a contrast. A king that would bring an end to wars. That would rule a kingdom which was based on righteousness, justice, where all were treated equally and well. An expression of the truth that God is indeed with us. Such a contrast to the way King Ahaz had ruled the nation. In essence, it all comes back to pride. We think we can do it better than God. We think we know better than God. And that's a spiral of disaster. But God had not left his people, and there was hope. And the hope would come with the birth of a young child who would become a great king. Yahweh, the name that is given to the God of Israel and Judah. The word carries the idea of the one who's self-existent, but also the God of relationship. And that speaks volumes about the nature of the God who made the universe. Delivering the people from the onslaught that was awaiting them from Assyria. How is God going to do it? The trouble is we think God's going to do it by violence and force, by giving us better resources than the opposition. But the resources are seen in terms of physical resources. That's not God's way, and Isaiah grasped that. God's way is through vulnerability. You can't think of anything more vulnerable than an infant being born, utterly dependent on the parents and those around. But in that infant was the picture that God was still with them in human frailty. God works in a different way. He doesn't work by violence or coercion or pushing us around. He works in our lives through vulnerability. Isaiah saw that in the birth of a son, his own son, before that son had really grown very much, God, who was with his people, would intervene and would neutralize the threats that were coming from Assyria, different from Assyria, Syria the nation, Assyria, Israel confederacy. And this child symbolized God with us. God had not left his people. God was quite capable of rescuing them, and the vulnerability of a child gave the picture, the model for Isaiah. God was still with his people. But Isaiah saw in that, in his own life and his own family, he saw something of a much, much bigger picture. This was a principle by which God worked. God would come in the birth of a child totally human, but one who would be endowed with the fullness of God. God with us. God was going to come into our human frailty, into our situation, to bring transformation and renewal. That was the picture that Isaiah was beginning to grasp, and it's worked out bit by bit throughout this book. This is God's way. You see, in our human cultures, we go down the route of violence. Doesn't matter what you call them, and if you look at them today or in history, they go down the route of violence, coercion, pushing other people around. Ruling classes get established. They gain power. They eliminate the rivals. They impose their wishes, and then they use strength and violence to get their way. And you can look at all these four and any other system you can think of. It always is the same. That's the human way. It should not be the way for us as God's people. And this is where King Ahaz got it wrong. He was going down the route of trying to make agreements, negotiations, pacts, in order to stand against the violence around. That's not God's way. And we, the people of God today, and down through history, have got it wrong so often. We've resorted to the ways of the world around. Doesn't work. Never works. And Jesus came to bring the kingdom of God. It's totally different in character and nature. Utterly different. But Isaiah was beginning to grasp, following his revelation in the temple, he was beginning to grasp how God was working, how God would work, and what God would do to express his concern, his love, his caring for humankind. God's agenda is the best for us. But he doesn't push us around. He doesn't use violence to get his way. He knows what's best, and he knows our foolishness. But he doesn't come and throw his weight around. The kingdom of God is totally different in character, and Isaiah grasped that, the vulnerability of a coming infant. What a beautiful, remarkable insight and picture. And then in this section, in this presentation and in the next one, we're going to look at as Isaiah saw something into the future. He saw what would happen to the northern kingdom of Israel at the hands of Assyria. And then he saw what would happen to Assyria, the empire. He saw something of what was going to happen to Judah, the southern kingdom, in a longer term. He saw again another picture of this new kingship for the people of God, so different from the failed kingship of Ahaz. And he saw the reaction of the people when this would happen. And we're going to trace through these 5 pictures that were given to Isaiah, which is presented to us in this presentation and in the following presentation. Let's go back to our map. There was a kind of jockeying for power between the Assyrian Empire and the Babylonian Empire. At this particular time, the Assyrian Empire became top dog. Later, the Babylonian Empire would become top dog and topple the Assyrian Empire completely and destroy them. And then the Babylonian Empire would finally fall itself. But their goal was to get Egypt. But in the way were Israel and Judah. They were caught in the crossfire, and they were trivial, they were small, they didn't have power, they didn't have resources. And the Assyrian Empire could just walk straight through them and destroy them with wanton brutality. That's the context. What was going to happen? That's what Isaiah records. The Lord has sent a message against Jacob. That's the people of God, the northern kingdom of Israel. Now the word that's translated message there, a message expressing events, incorporating meaning. It wasn't just words. It's events, but events that carried a meaning. And 4 times, that phrase is used. God had come to the people of Israel again and again and again to try to win them back, to make them listen. He spoke them again and again through the prophets. They refused again and again. They moved out from God's protection. God's protection was removed. If you like, his hand was still upraised. Disaster struck. Comes back to leadership, as it so often does. Leaders carry great responsibilities. Ponder entering leadership in any field and walk of life. But when the leadership goes wrong, the led usually suffer. The leadership so often has got protection and has lined their own pockets, and they cope. It's the ordinary people that suffer. And you can see that down through history. And that was what was going to happen tragically to Israel. You can look at the archaeological records and historical records, and you can see that wealth had been pouring into making Samaria, that's the capital of Israel, the northern kingdom, elegant and luxurious, but for the ruling elite. and pride had overtaken that elite. They'd pushed God to the edge. They'd locked him up in the religious institutions. They'd systematized him and pushed him out. And when we do that, society corrupts. There's a simple logical reason. When we put ourselves and our wishes and our desires at the centre, then selfishness starts to rule. And we do what we want for the benefit of us. And sooner or later that comes at the expense of others who are trying to do the same thing. So there's a corruption, a decaying, a deception. Things fall apart. And as I say this, you can look out on much of Western culture today and see this exactly happening, tragically, before our eyes. And when society corrupts, it's open to attack. It hasn't got the inner strength, the fibre to stand. And again, societies and cultures have gone through this. When the corruption has eaten away at their inner soul, they become weak, vulnerable. They collapse. And Isaiah writes, but the people have not returned to him who struck them. God has spoken to them again and again through events. They wouldn't return, nor have they sought the Lord Almighty. So the Lord will cut off from Israel both head and tail, both palm branch and reed in a single day. The elders and dignitaries are the head. The prophets who teach lies are the tail. Those who guide this people mislead them, and those who are guided are led astray. What a terrible picture. And yet history shows it was exactly true of what was happening at the time. The leadership class were lining their pockets, and people were pretending to be prophets were in their pockets because they got the backhanders. And the people suffered. They always do. Tragic picture. And this is what happened. Israel, the northern kingdom, had faced one bloody coup after another as people struggled and battled with each other for power. The leaders had led astray, but the led had been happy to be led astray. Be happy to have God pushed out of their lives to do what they wanted and to live selfishly. They've been intertribal feuding. Again, this is what happens. Jockeying for power, position, wealth. And overall, the ruling elites had enriched themselves at the expense of others. That's what always happens. And in the United Kingdom at the moment, as I say this, figures have just come out to show that the division and the gap between the rich and the poor is still widening. We're following in the same way. Equality before the law had gone. The judges were being bribed. Today, those who have money can employ the best lawyers. And equality before the law has gone too. You see, when you take God out of the equation, when you push God out, when God's people lose their way, when they no longer have God at the centre of their agenda, then we become the centre of our agenda, and our selfish wishes start to rule. Society starts to corrupt. And those who don't have are the ones who suffer. Because we're all looking at it, what's in it for me, for myself. And you can see this in the commentaries on television, at every election, at every decision, at every budget. What's in it for me? Selfishness rules and the society corrupts inwardly, and it's ripe for collapse. That was what was happening and had happened. You see, that's the key thing for us as God's people. We've been given so much. But what we've done is, we've systematized God. We've locked him up in our churches. We've privatized him. We've no longer lived our lives with him at the centre. We're following our own agenda and paying lip service to God. And that's a description of Western culture today. And what Isaiah had grasped, faced with the potential onslaught of the empire of Assyria with all their brutality, the answer did not lie in military might, power, or resources, alliances, tactics, plans, or organization. None of these things. The answer lay in putting their own house in order. God was well able to look after them. But if we won't allow God to look after us, well, we brought it upon ourselves. That word judgment, so often misunderstood because it's not easy to capture the idea of the original language. It's got this strong element in the word and the concept of God coming to put things right. We thumb our noses at God, we push him to the edge, we run our own things, selfishness and corruption start to build up and rule. And God says, enough is enough, the poor are suffering enough. He comes to put things right. But the judgment is in how we treat each other. Now just stop and ponder for the moment. In your own Christian group, church, society, how are we treating each other? Leaders, how are you treating the led? The led, how are you treating the leaders? How are we treating each other? Because the way of Jesus is that our agenda is the best for the other, no matter what the cost is for us. God so loved the world that he gave. That's the model, that's the picture. Isaiah was getting it. He'd captured it right. The ultimate judgment of us as the people of God today is how we treat each other. Because how we treat each other expresses where God is in our life. And if we turn God and reduced him to a religious system, a religious performance that we go through on Sunday, a set of rituals that we go through, if we lock up God in our churches, in our religious language, that cuts no ice with God. It's how we treat each other. And we can only treat each other well when we are in a relationship with God, where God is at the center. That's the great truth that Isaiah was grasping, presenting to us. Leaders can be political, spiritual, and sometimes a bit of both. And we have the led. That was what was happening in the northern kingdom of Israel. It was also happening in the southern kingdom of Judah. But the led very often let the leaders get away with it. They elevate the leaders to get the backhanders. But when we rebel against God's order of life, because his order of life is the best, when we rebel against it, and we're driven by that rebellion, it affects the leaders and the led, but perhaps the leaders more. And basically driven by pride and arrogance. We think we know better. We think we can do it better. We think we can take our decisions. We think by our strategies, plans and programs we can resolve the problems. You can see it in our society today. It was writ large in Israel and Judah then. But what it leads is societal breakdown. Because each of us is in it for what we can get from it. And society starts to inwardly corrupt and it falls apart. If God is not the center of our lives as individuals and communities, as God's people, if we are not pursuing his agenda, then we end up pursuing our own agenda. And my agenda conflicts with yours, and yours conflicts with somebody else's. And society starts to break down. That's the picture that was true then. Tragically, it's true today. And what happened then will happen today, in the not too distant future, unless we, the people of God, put our house in order. There's a clear message from what Isaiah was saying. You see, there's a choice for us. These are not restrictive principles. This is not a rule book mentality. When we seek God's ways, when we ask Him to guide us and direct us, when we seek His resources to enable us to do it. If you're like, in New Testament language, when we come into the kingdom of God and say, I want Jesus to be king. I want to do it His way, because His way is the best way. He made us after all. But the alternative is, do it our way. And what we have done so often, as was happening then, that we've pushed God to the edge, lip service to religion. We've gone through the ritual and the performance, but the reality has slowly drifted away. In essence, we're living in rebellion. We're doing it our way. And sooner or later that brings tragedy. Because if we each live for the benefit of the other, it means fulfilled living, shared by all, not restricted to some ruling elite. But when we live in rebellion, it means that the strong get stronger and the weak go to the wall. And that has been a picture of the history of humankind for centuries and millennia. Someone said something like that. We either live in the glory of lives fulfilling all that God intended for us, or, the choice, we end up smashing up our lives in confrontation and failure. It's a tough message. Isaiah got it, and he saw the consequences for the northern kingdom of Israel, and we'll see in a moment they came true, tragically. Literally smashed up. That's the choice, and this message is particularly for the West today. A choice that faces us, the people of God. We either live in the glory of lives fulfilling all that God intended for us, life to the full, life with a capital L, or we'll tear the whole thing apart and smash ourselves up. And at the moment we're heading in the latter direction. God is opposed to all these things. Right throughout the Old and New Testament, again and again and again. The phrase so often is widows and orphans. Those who had nothing in society, there being no social welfare state. But Isaiah saw that it wouldn't be the great empire of Assyria that would smash everything up. Israel, the northern kingdom, getting it first, then Judah second. Society would fall apart and be overrun because the people had rebelled. They'd pushed God to the edge. They were living their lives selfishly for what they wanted. And the whole of society was corrupting and weakening and had no chance of standing against anybody. God was well able to protect them from the might of Assyria. The might of Assyria was nothing compared to the glory and the power of the God who made the universe. But when we push God away, when we come out from the umbrella of His protection, we're vulnerable. And it's seen as society falls apart. Now let me just change that slightly. See the middle paragraphs change? This is a prophetic message for the West today, for us, the people of God. There are two forces coming against the West. But it won't be Islam or humanism that brings down the nations of the West. Humanly speaking, we have no chance against either. Both are much more powerful. Humanly speaking, they're bound to win one or other. And they'll probably battle it out between each other. And we'll be caught in the crossfire. But it won't be that. The problem is us, not the forces around us. Because we are rebelling. And we're trying to do it our way, rather than coming under the protection of God's way. worth stopping and pondering that. And if you're listening to this in a group, stopping and just discussing it and praying it through. There are deep messages from Isaiah for us today. Let us put our house in order as the people of God. That's all we can do. Let's bring ourselves under the protection of God, because we put God right at the center of everything. He determines our agenda, and our agenda then becomes the agenda for the best for the other. No matter what they've done to us, and no matter what it costs us, because that's God's way. Vulnerability. To be seen in the vulnerability of an infant just after birth. Back to our map. The attacks of Assyria, the threats on their way through to Egypt. This is what Isaiah saw. But the fault lay with Israel. He's addressing the northern kingdom at the moment. That's what he saw would happen. Now, what did happen? Utter wipeout. The nation just disappeared. Completely taken over by Assyria with utter brutality. And about another 20 years later, Judah was sacked. And the army of Sennacherib got right to Jerusalem. Now they didn't take Jerusalem because the king then was Hezekiah. And Hezekiah had listened to Isaiah and had gone into the temple and asked God's help. And Jerusalem survived and was spared. And Hezekiah's king lived out his years as king. The principles were exactly as Isaiah had said. Now let's move on. What about Assyria? That describes this brutal empire. But as it accumulated wealth and as it had the best army in the area, the skills they had as an army were incredible. Disciplined, organized, conscription army, systematized, team of engineers building new equipment. And they thought that gave them the right to sack and destroy at will. Pride entered them, and they simply revelled in mindless brutality. The descriptions in their literature of some of the things they did to people they captured are simply horrendously cruel. And openly they mocked Yahweh, the name given to the God of Judah. The God who is self-existent, the God who made the universe, but the God who is the God of relationship. And this is what Isaiah said: you've abused your power. This is God's message to you. God says through Isaiah, woe to the Assyrian, the rod of my anger. The Assyrians had come and were causing trouble all round about. Woe to them. They'd gone far too far. Wantonly brutal and evil. When the Lord finished all his work against Mount Zion and Jerusalem, he will say, I will punish the king of Assyria for the willful pride of his heart and the haughty look in his eyes. Therefore the Lord Almighty, will send a wasting disease upon his sturdy warriors. Under his pomp a fire will be kindled like a blazing fire. The light of Israel become a fire, their Holy One a flame. In a single day it will burn and consume his thorns and briars. The splendour of his forests and fertile fields it will completely destroy, as when one who is ill wastes away. But the remaining trees of his forests will be so few that a child could write them down. Here is a picture of what is going to happen. What is going to happen to the empire of Assyria? God is pictured here as the light of Israel. The light of Israel. That's a lovely picture. God was still looking after his people, even though his people had rebelled and rebelled and rebelled. And Assyria had taken advantage, caused utter destruction. But what Isaiah saw was that God was in control, not Assyria. And the world of Assyria was just going to be wiped out like a brushwood fire. And the empire would disappear. Isaiah is given the vision and the understanding of what's happening in God's plan. Their continual expansion, it generated internal warfare because the people within Assyria were competing with each other for power. It weakened the empire. And about 100 years later, it completely was wiped out. Just after its final major attack on Jerusalem. Then there's hope for the people of God. In that day, the remnant of Israel, the survivors of Jacob, will no longer rely on him who struck them down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return, a remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God. Though your people be like the sand by the sea, Israel, only a remnant will return. Destruction has been decreed, overwhelming and righteous. The Lord Almighty will carry it out, the destruction decreed upon the whole land. Assyria attacked and wiped out the northern kingdom of Israel. They attacked, decimated, and almost took the southern kingdom of Judah. Assyria was struck from within with internal competition and jockeying for power amongst the leadership. They'd stretched their resources too far. Their society was corrupted beyond belief. They were ripe for fall. They'd conquered the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire got its revenge and took them over, smashed them up. But the Babylonian Empire was evil and wantonly cruel too. The Babylonian Empire finished the job that the Assyrians hadn't achieved. They wiped out Judah. They captured Jerusalem. They burned the city to the ground. And then they deported vast proportions of the population back into the area round the Euphrates River. But Isaiah pictures something beyond that. The remnant of Israel. The idea of a remnant surviving. Now there's good and bad about that. Because it gave Isaiah hope that some would survive. It all happened exactly as Isaiah had pictured it. God had shown him. But the bad news is that most would not. The people of God, the people of Judah, had removed themselves from the protection of God, from the umbrella of his protection. By their own choice, they'd gone their own way, thumbed their nose at God, locked him up in the temple, done their own thing, pursued their own selfish agendas. Without God's protection, most would not survive. Remember Isaiah named his son Shear-Jashub, which means the remnant will return. And some of the messages that Isaiah was seeing were connected with the birth of his two sons. And their names carry something of the significance and the meaning of events that were to happen. It happened after the days of Isaiah. You see, God's people had rebelled. They'd lost God's protection. If we do that, sooner or later, disasters will take place. If you look at the situation across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom in the 20th century, just look at involvement in churches and Christian groups. The data is all there. It reached a peak just after the Second World War, and it's been declining ever since. But looking back, you can see the seeds of the disasters were all there. We had locked God up in our churches. We'd centered it round religious systems, religious rituals. And the reality of God is Yahweh, the Lord of the universe, but also the personal God, the God of relationship. We'd lost it. Yes, minorities had retained it, but overall we lost it. And when we lose God's protection, because we've pushed God to the edge, He's no longer part of our lives, He's no longer the center, He's no longer guiding us and determining our agendas, sooner or later, disasters will take place. That's what happened to Israel and Judah. And only a remnant was going to come back. By God's grace, a remnant did come back, and from that remnant that did come back from the land of Babylon, a nation was re-established. A temple was rebuilt, and into that nation was born Jesus in due time. But you see, where the people had gone wrong was that they were not relying on the Lord. And they had to learn the hard way that this is the answer. It's not God coming and jumping upon us and punishing us. It's when we turn away and do it our own way and reject His guidance, we lose out. And through the hard experiences of the exile, the people had to rethink everything. And you can see it in the book of Ezekiel, who's a prophet to the people in exile. You can see the beginnings of it being worked out again. And it took the people a long time for the penny to drop. There are so many parallels with our Western culture and society today. We've got to stop and ponder this. Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty says. My people who live in Zion, do not be afraid of the Assyrians who beat you up with a rod and lift up a club against you as Egypt did. Very soon my anger against you will end, and my wrath will be directed to their destruction. The Lord Almighty will lash them with a whip, as when He struck down Midian at the rock of Oreb, and He will raise His staff over the waters as He did in Egypt. In that day their burden will be lifted from your shoulders, their yoke from your neck. The yoke will be broken because you've grown so fat, grown so strong, because you're in me. There's the message. Whatever enemies are facing us, the people of God today, the command of God to us is do not fear them. The command of God to us is the same as Isaiah said. Put your house in order. Live your lives my way. Bring yourself under the umbrella of my protection. I'll look after you. But you do it my way, which is the way of love, the way of vulnerability, not the way of strategy, programs, violence, coercion. Do not fear the Assyrians. The word burden means that we're rendering service. The land of Judah had to pay vast sums of money to buy peace for quite a long time, stripping the land of its wealth. And if you're under a yoke, you're under the orders. the same as an animal under a yoke is under the orders of the master in the ploughing of the field. No longer would they have to pay the money to Assyria. No longer would they be under the rule of Assyria. They'd be strong enough in God to break the yoke. They'd grown strong. Many people argue about the translation of the last line there. Simply, we do not know, but the meaning is quite clear, although the detail of the words is not. Strength would return to God's people by God's grace. Only by God's grace. The strength comes in the strength God has provided. And that is the strength of the vulnerability to be seen in an infant. There are deep principles of the way God works amongst his people, and was working then and works today. A lot of messages are important here for us. In the world today, might seems to be right. And you're seeing that today in the jockeying for power between the nations of the world. In Eastern Europe, in the Middle East, around China, North Korea, in bits of Africa, and all over Europe. That's not the way of the people of God. They say we get the leadership we deserve, and there's truth in that. What do we want? And let's think of our spiritual leadership. Deep messages here for us today. But if we push God out, if we lock him up in our churches in religious ritual and performance, thinking that God's pleased with it, if we do it in certain ways, we forfeit his protection, because that's not God's way. God is the God of relationship. God is the God of vulnerability. And Jesus set up a kingdom, not a religious system. And in that kingdom, for each of us, our agenda is the best for the other. Our remnant will return. Let us hope that we, the people of God, will learn our lessons quickly, so that we will not be overrun and destroyed structurally by the forces around us. And we can't win the battles, but we can put our house in order. It doesn't come by our planning, negotiation and programs. That's where Ahaz went wrong. Hezekiah went wrong. It comes when we're vulnerable and serving Jesus. God is well able to put things right, and he's well able to look after us. In the days of Isaiah, that's what was happening. The people became flabby, weak, and spiritually lost. The culture collapsed. They were ripe for takeover. But Assyria had rampant pride, and they had some achievements. That didn't work either. The empire fell. God was opposed to these things then. He's still opposed to them today. But what Isaiah was telling the people was that the problem wasn't Assyria. The problem was themselves. Because by their rebellion against God and trying to run it their own way, they'd pushed God to the sidelines of their society. Their society was corrupting and falling apart, and they were ripe for collapse. That's a great principle for us today. Sadly, what we're seeing now is precisely that happening. And in Western culture, there are deliberate moves and attempts to push God out of the center of life. Lock him up in your religious systems. Don't let him touch the real life of decisions. And we are facing two very powerful forces. One religious and one kind of political cultural. They'll both end up with the same thing. They'll take over the West. And we will not be able to stand against them, and our plans and programs won't succeed. And you can see people trying today and it not working. We don't know how to stand against the violence. Because the problem lies in us, not in the external forces. The message of Isaiah for today. The next presentation, we're going to look at hope from the ashes of destruction.